Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to Old Band New Sound, Yay or Nay. Part 1. There will be a part 2 to this video here, so keep an eye out for that. Every band and artist likes to be hip, new, fresh, and on top of the charts. Lots of them have tried to reinvent themselves over time, but the question is, did it work? So join me as I run through 10 old bands changing their sound, hoping to be popular again. I'm going to give my opinion on it and then you weigh in and let me know if you think it works or not. Before we get started in this though, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, if you turn on notifications, you're going to stay up to date on really cool videos just like this with old band, new sound, yay or nay. So as I said, this is part 1. We're going to start with A and we're going to run through J, and then the next episode we'll pick up and continue the rest of the alphabet. First one up here, Aerosmith. How could we not talk about Aerosmith? Band formed in 1970, straight out of the gate, amazing hard rock band, releasing albums like Toys in the Attic, an absolute classic album from 1975. Most popular album, I think it's gone on to sell something like 9 million copies just in the US alone. Now, by the 80s and into the late 80s, the band had reinvented themselves and really become a glam metal band by the time of Pump in 1989. Now, this is the time period that I grew up with the band, so I'm actually partial to this era of the band as opposed to the classic 70s era that I know lots of other people who grew up during that era are. And then the thing is, the band would attempt to change and modernize again by the late 90s and early 2000s when they put out Just Push Play from 2001. And this one here has, more pop elements, samples, drum loops, things of that in it. And just from all of that, Just Push Play to me has almost none of the characteristics of something like Toys in the Attic. I still felt a kinship between the 70s era and the 80s era of the band. I didn't have a problem moving between them. Listening to Pump, I could easily move back to the stuff of the 70s, but today, and even though I lived through the era that they put out Just Push Play, I have a hard time going back to that. It just doesn't sound like Aerosmith to me. So for me at least, when they did the 2001 album, I tried to like it at that time. I will say it has grown on me a lot since then, and I can put it on if I'm in the right mood, but I don't think that one worked nearly as well as their period moving from the 70s hard rock into the sort of glam metal sounds that they did and so forth. But you guys weigh in and let me know what you think of that. All right, next one up, Bad Company. Band started in 1973. They were a supergroup of sorts. You got Paul Rodgers and Simon Kirke coming from Free. You had, the guitar player coming from Mott the Hoople in there, Mick Ralphs, and so forth. So lots of, cool guys coming and bringing their fan base and so forth. And they released their self-titled 1974 album, which was more blues, hard rock, that sort of stuff, which you'd expect from the 70s. Sort of just a straight hard rock and sound band. But they broke up towards the end of the 70s there and then reformed, but with a different lineup, different vocalists. Brian Howe now coming in and released some really great AOR melodic rock albums like this one here, Dangerous Age, in 1988. So to go from blues rock, straight ahead kind of rock sounding to more AOR melodic rock sounding, while not too different, the bands really do sound night and day different. I think the biggest thing comes from the lack of Paul Rodgers' writing in the 80s because he wasn't there. Mick Ralphs, who did a lot of writing with Paul Rodgers in the 70s, was less involved, and you actually had the producer Terry Thomas doing more of it, which really split off the group, and the group became more of a vehicle for Brian Howe than as a Mick Ralphs, Simon Kirke continuation of the sound. Again, my age and when I came into the band was the 80s, and I absolutely love that 80s era of Bad Company, even into the 90s when they tried to return to that more blues rock sound. But I will say this, that while both periods were very successful, it is interesting how they basically tried to sort of squash the 80s era of the band and only focus on the 70s era. But then that is because Paul Rodgers is running the show currently. I think both worked equally. I love both equally and can listen to them back to back and have no problems. But again, you guys weigh in. All right, next one up, Boston, who formed in 1974. Debut album, self-titled, 1976 release, AOR melodic rock at its finest, mixing acoustic instrumentation with electric. And then they would put out a quick follow-up there in 77, 78, Don't Look Back, I think was the title of it. But, you know, it wasn't until 1986 when they put out their third album, Third Stage. While still AOR and melodic rock, this one was a heavily layered, produced 80s sounding album that was very different than that sort of classic rock sounding debut and follow-up album. And while, again, it still very much had the Boston sound and everything, it was fully 80ized if that's a word, sound to it. I like both periods of it, but not, you know, they're really two different things that are going on. That acoustic instrumentation layered with the electric instrumentation was really gone by Third Stage. So, you know, did it work? Did it not? Again, you guys weigh in on it. Okay, moving on. Next one up, Alice Cooper. We're talking both about the band and the artist here. Alice Cooper, the band, formed in 1964, actually as just a high school thing. Put out some of the best early 70s hard rock albums like Billion Dollar Babies in 1973. But then Alice Cooper goes solo, and he's basically a chameleon and, you know, changing. And that's actually why I'm wearing the David Bowie shirt here, because this guy changed on everything, but so much so that I don't think we can actually pin down any one period for him. But Alice Cooper, by 1978, puts out a new wave album. By the late 80s, in 1989, he does Trash, which is glam metal. And then continuing into 2000, Brutal Planet and nu metal. And he did change a lot of times and styles and things of that nature, but he was known as a hard rock artist, and he constantly revisited that and so forth. And I think from, maybe Flush the Fashion, not so much, because that was very distinctly different. But when he stayed on the rock roots, so you've got the Billion Dollar Baby stuff, you've got, the glam metal era of Trash, even the albums right before that were basically straight metal. But when he tried to do nu metal and that sort of stuff, the sort of more even grunge influenced sound things, I don't think those worked as much. I think it's when artists start to go out of their comfort zone that starts to create the problems. And that's what happened here, in my opinion. I love Billion Dollar Babies. I can even get on to Flush the Fashion with the new wave sort of stuff. Trash, my era, absolutely love it. I think it's one of the greatest albums ever, period. But Brutal Planet, I liked it at the time, meaning I was trying to get into it. I listened to it a lot, but it is not one I go back to, and it's just not my cup of tea in terms of what I want to hear when I think of Alice Cooper. All right, next up, I know this one's going to be a big debate here. Def Leppard, who formed in 1976, and they were part of the new wave of British heavy metal. Put out an absolute classics album of that era, High and Dry, 1981. Amazing hits that came off of that and stuff. Hadn't really quite broken through just yet, as they were going to do with Pyromania. But then when Hysteria comes around in 1987, basically a pop metal, heavily layered production sound done by Mutt Lange, the album exploded. It has sold so many copies across the world and so forth, defining the 80s, defining Def Leppard, but it was not the sounds of High and Dry, the new wave of British heavy metal sound that they started with. And then the thing is, they would go on and change again with 1996's slang, downtuning, becoming darker, more grunge influenced even on here, less of that layered production that we had sort of grown to know the band as. And then it just kind of all goes off the rails with their album X or 10 in 2002, where they basically have a boy band pop sound by that point, but it's very layered, or very heavy produced album, I should say. And so this is one of those ones where The early stuff for the band, of course, it works. It's great, and it's what a lot of people know. And I think Hysteria worked. Again, that's when I came up with the band and was into it. But I can go back to that earlier stuff, and I think that it works, and it's not a problem. Even Slang still worked as an album. There was enough elements on it and things of that nature that I think could carry it through, even though there was the one or two big misses on it, like the title track Slang. But once they got to the album X, where they were basically trying to be a boy band, and it was kind of all pop songs that were on it, just a huge, huge misstep on it. But I know there's going to be a lot of you guys that think Hysteria was a big misstep and so forth. But you guys weigh in and let me know. All right, here's another one I know going to be a big debate on. Genesis, formed in 1967, start off as a prog rock, deep in the prog rock, releasing a classic album like The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway in '74, featuring Peter Gabriel as the vocalist for that lineup, where then they're going to go through a shifting period, changing guitar players and vocalists and so forth. And by the mid-'80s, in '86 or so, putting out Invisible Touch, which is just a straight up pop album. I know some people have argued with me saying that there's still some prog elements and whatnot. And yes, there are some of that in it, but it is not the prog band of the '70s. And did it work? Absolutely. I think they were, obviously, we can look at album sales. Invisible Touch, bigger than anything that the band had done before that. Which of the two albums do I like better? Invisible Touch. I'm a Phil Collins fan. And again, I'm sure you've already picked up on this, but a lot of my likes in this has to do with my age and when I came up in music, which was through the '80s. So I'm going to lean on that. I'm a huge Peter Gabriel fan, but I'm a fan of his stuff from the '80s, not so much when he was with Genesis. But I know that Genesis, as the prog era, was very successful, looked very highly upon. And I think this is a classic case where both eras of the band are beloved by those fans, and they magically somehow made it work. Perhaps Genesis wouldn't have worked if they hadn't modified their sound and so forth, and would have died off as dinosaurs and so forth. But they did. And again, you guys can weigh in and let me know your thoughts on that. All right, here's another one. Guns N' Roses, formed in 1985, coming out with their debut album in 1987, Appetite for Destruction, some of the hardest rock, sleaziest, dirtiest rock of the 80s. They were a glam metal band. I'm not even going to call it that here, because this album was a game changer, which moved glam metal away from what it was doing at that time into more of the straight ahead hard rock and so forth. And they go through, each album is a little different than the others, but when you get to 2008, you have basically an entirely different lineup here for Chinese Democracy. Now they're adding samples, drum loops, layered production. Basically they throw in everything, including the kitchen sink on this. And while I think the songs are extremely strong, and I love the album itself, and I love hearing Axl sing on it, it doesn't sound like Guns N' Roses in the sense that it doesn't sound like Appetite. But for what it is, and we have to remember the huge long period between 1991 and 2008, a 17-year gap in there where the band has developed over that time, I do think that the album works, and I love it for what it is. And I've seen recently that more people and more people have been accepting it, whereas this album had only gone gold at the time. In recent years, since the band has reformed and playing lots and lots of this stuff at shows, the album has gone on to sell 1 million copies and more. So I think a lot more people are warming up to that album than did at the time, now having it sort of have a revisionist view on it. All right, another band that made a huge change, Heart, who formed in '73, putting out some absolute classic hard rock and melodic rock, even a little bit of folk rock mixed in with that early stuff. Beautiful pairing of vocals between the two sisters, Ann and Nancy Wilson, and Nancy's amazing guitar work that she was doing back then and so forth. Releasing in 1980, my favorite of their early era albums, Be Lestrange, which is just a great straight up hard rock masterpiece in my opinion. But by 1985, the band had completely changed, releasing their self-titled album where they brought in outside writers to essentially make a pop album, or as I even see it, a glam metal album. Thing is, both of them are absolutely stellar. Huge success for this. I think whether you like the music or not, you can't say that the band wasn't successful in both eras. I love both eras of the band. I grew up listening to the stuff that they did early on before doing that, and then when that album came out, it was easy to jump onto that 1985 album and just move forward. But it was a very different pop sounding band than what had come before. All right, next one, Billy Idol, who started with Generation X in 1976 and was a punk artist at that time, then goes solo and releases an all-time classic 80s album, Rebel Yell, in 1983 with a mix of hard rock, punk, and even pop elements thrown in. He was one that was never really pigeonholed, although it's interesting how that punk moniker has followed him, and he's never really been all that much punk. But by 1993, a decade later, he releases Cyberpunk, an album that actually has punk in the title, yet it's really a techno dance pop album with absolutely no punk in it, to my recollection at least. And while I did like the song Shock to the System, which was kind of the closest thing he had to any of his earlier sounding stuff, it just was not something that worked for me. It was an album of a sound that did not really fit his vocals and so forth. So I don't think that it worked for Billy Idol in this regard, but you guys can weigh in. I'm sure there's some fans out there of this album, although I'm not really one of them. It's an album I do not go back to at this point. And the last one we're going to talk about for this episode, part one, remember there will be a part two, is Judas Priest, who formed in 1969 and released some great early albums in the 70s and really kind of defining their sound and stuff. But by 1980, in British steel, full-on hard rock metal opus here, kind of spearheading the new wave of British heavy metal, even though they started a long time before that. But there was a number of early 70s bands that still were considered part of that movement, and Judas Priest being one of them, releasing an absolute classic album like that. But by 1986, Turbo, a very pop metal album, something that was different. And again, Judas Priest is one of those bands that makes very different albums, but this one here was wildly different than anything they had done before. In fact, the album right before it, Defenders of the Faith, was a very heavy album with some almost thrash metal, speed metal moments on it. And then you've got this one here. And so it's funny because this album title has become one of those things that a lot of people, when describing that one-off album or a misstep of an album, people will say, well, that's the band's Turbo album. And it's kind of become that, but there are a lot of fans out there, myself included, who love Turbo, even though it's really a pop metal album. Then they would turn around by the end of the 80s with the 1990s Painkiller, which was almost a thrash album. And so they keep making the changes in there. For me, at least, I have loved every era of Judas Priest. I don't think they can do any wrong. You guys let me know what you think of it. And that concludes at least part one here for Old Band, New Sound, Yay or Nay. 10 bands changing their sounds. Of course, did it work? You're going to let me know on that. Remember, there will be a part two to this. It's going to be posting very shortly, so keep an eye out for that. And there'll be 10 more bands when we do that one. All right, everyone, take care. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.